In the autumn of 1955, as Cold War tensions permeated every aspect of Soviet-American relations, a group of Soviet journalists stood speechless on the production floor of the New York Times printing facility. What they witnessed contradicted everything they'd been told about capitalist media. Millions of newspapers rolling off massive presses every single day, each packed with content that would have filled entire weekly editions back home. "It is simply not possible," muttered Alexei Adjubey, editor of Izvestia and son-in-law of Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, as he watched the industrial symphony of ink and paper. "Our entire Soviet printing capacity in Moscow could not match what this single American building produces in one night." Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. The Soviet delegation's astonishment at American newspaper production wasn't merely about industrial capacity. It represented a fundamental collision between two information ecosystems that had developed in isolation from each other for decades. What these visiting journalists experienced in 1955 was more than a technological revelation. It was cultural shock that would ultimately help shift the Soviet Union's understanding of itself in relation to the West. The story begins in the early months of 1955, during what historians now recognize as the first thaw in Cold War relations. Following Stalin's death in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev had begun consolidating power and introducing limited reforms. Among these was a cautious opening to cultural exchanges with the West, an unprecedented opportunity for Soviets to see America firsthand, and for Americans to glimpse life behind the Iron Curtain. The State Department, recognizing the propaganda potential, approved a delegation of Soviet editors and journalists to tour major American cities and media operations. The Soviets, equally calculating, selected their representatives carefully, proven party loyalists who could be trusted to return with appropriately critical assessments of capitalist media. The delegation included editors from Pravda, Izvestia, and several regional Soviet newspapers, all publications with circulations that rarely exceeded a few 100,000 copies daily. What neither side fully anticipated was the genuine shock that would come from this direct comparison of media systems that had evolved in complete isolation from each other. The Soviets arrived in New York in October 1955, expecting to find confirmation of what their own propaganda had told them, that American newspapers were dominated by wealthy business interests filled with frivolous content and limited in distribution to the privileged classes. Instead, they found something that defied their understanding of modern media. The New York Times alone printed over 500,000 copies daily, more than many Soviet regional papers printed in a week. The Washington Post circulation approached 400,000. Even more stunning was the Chicago Tribune, which regularly printed close to 1 million copies daily. These weren't special editions or propaganda exercises. This was the normal daily operation of American newspapers. "We expected to see impressive facilities," recalled Dmitry Goryanov of TASS news agency in a classified report that would later be declassified in the 1990s. "What we did not expect was the sheer industrial scale. Their largest presses operate virtually continuously, and the amount of paper consumed in a single day would supply one of our major newspapers for weeks." The delegation's first stop, the New York Times, set the tone for their visit. Located in a sprawling building in Midtown Manhattan, the newspaper's printing operation occupied multiple floors. Soviet journalists were accustomed to cumbersome, often antiquated presses that required constant maintenance and produced limited runs. The Times, by contrast, had recently installed new high-speed rotary presses capable of printing 70,000 copies per hour. The logistics were equally impressive. The Times maintained its own fleet of delivery trucks that distributed papers throughout the metropolitan region before dawn each day. Papers destined for more distant locations were loaded onto trains and planes within hours of printing. By the time most Americans were eating breakfast, a newspaper that had existed only as blank paper the previous evening was already in their hands, containing news from around the world, analyzed and contextualized. The entire production chain operates with precise timing, noted Mikhail Satunov of Literaturnaya Gazeta. From the editorial offices where decisions are made about content, to the composing rooms where pages are assembled, to the massive presses that print the finished product, every step functions with minimal friction. It is like watching a finely tuned machine. What truly stunned the Soviet visitors, however, wasn't just the scale of production, but the content itself. American newspapers routinely ran to dozens of pages daily, far larger than even the most prestigious Soviet publications. The Sunday editions, with their multiple sections, magazines, and supplements, were larger than many Soviet books. The New York Times Sunday edition often exceeded 500 pages and weighed several pounds. One Sunday edition contains more information than a Soviet citizen might read in an entire month of newspapers, observed Pavel Naumov of Pravda, and this is reproduced millions of times, delivered to homes across the entire country, 7 days a week. The Soviet journalists were particularly struck by the diversity of content. While Soviet papers focused primarily on political developments, industrial production figures, and ideologically approved cultural content, American papers contained vast sections devoted to business, sports, entertainment, fashion, home decoration, and personal advice, topics that received minimal coverage in Soviet media. The classified advertising sections, where ordinary citizens could place personal advertisements, were completely foreign to the Soviet media landscape. Perhaps most significant was the abundance of international news. Despite Cold War tensions, American papers carried substantial reporting from within the Soviet Union and other communist countries, often with a level of detail that surprised the Soviet visitors. The contrast with Soviet coverage of America, which was typically limited to stories of labor unrest, racial discrimination, and imperialism, was stark. Their newspapers speak of our country every day, noted one delegate in a private journal, later found in Soviet archives. Our citizens rarely read anything about daily life in America. This creates an asymmetry of knowledge that may not serve our long-term interests. The differences extended beyond content to business models. Soviet publications were state-funded enterprises where economic considerations were secondary to ideological requirements. American newspapers, though often owned by wealthy families or corporations, depended primarily on advertising revenue and reader subscriptions. This commercial foundation, which Soviet ideology had taught was a fundamental weakness, seemed instead to fuel an expansion of content and distribution that state-sponsored media couldn't match. The delegation's tour continued beyond New York to other major media centers. In Washington, they visited the Washington Post, which was transforming under the leadership of Philip Graham from a respectable but unremarkable paper into a journalistic powerhouse. In Chicago, they toured the Tribune Tower, home to Colonel Robert R. McCormick's conservative Chicago Tribune, with its massive circulation and regional dominance. What became increasingly clear to the Soviet visitors was that American newspaper production represented more than just industrial capacity. It reflected a fundamentally different relationship between information and society. The sheer volume of content being produced and consumed daily suggested an information environment unlike anything in Soviet experience. The implications were profound and uncomfortable. Soviet media theory held that capitalist newspapers, controlled by business interests, served primarily to distract and manipulate the working classes. Yet the scale and scope of American newspaper production suggested something more complex. Millions of Americans across social classes voluntarily purchased and read these publications daily. Whatever their ideological limitations, these papers were clearly meeting some genuine social need. The Soviet journalists' official reports, filed upon their return, acknowledged the technical achievements of American newspaper production, while maintaining ideological criticism of content. Yet private accounts and later memoirs revealed deeper impressions. Several delegates would subsequently advocate for expanded newspaper production and distribution within the Soviet Union, arguing that the party's message could be more effectively conveyed through more robust media channels. One immediate outcome was a push to modernize Soviet printing technology. Within 2 years of the delegation's return, several major Soviet newspapers had installed newer presses and expanded their page counts. Pravda and Izvestia began producing somewhat larger weekend editions with more diverse content, though still tightly controlled. The circulation figures, though increased, remained far below American levels. A more subtle but significant change came in content. Soviet papers began gradually expanding their international coverage, including more reporting on everyday life in capitalist countries rather than focusing exclusively on political and economic crises. Cultural coverage became somewhat broader, and consumer-oriented content slowly increased. While these changes were modest by Western standards, they represented a meaningful evolution in Soviet media practices. For Alexei Adjubey, the Izvestia editor and Khrushchev's son-in-law, the American visit proved particularly consequential. Upon returning to Moscow, he began implementing changes at Izvestia that made it somewhat more reader-friendly, with expanded coverage of everyday concerns and slightly more diverse content. When Khrushchev appointed him editor-in-chief in 1959, he pushed these changes further, making Izvestia the most Western-influenced of major Soviet publications. The timing of the 1955 delegation coincided with broader changes in Soviet society. Khrushchev's famous secret speech denouncing Stalin's crimes came just months later in February 1956, signaling a limited political thaw. The cultural opening continued with the 1957 World Youth Festival in Moscow, which brought thousands of foreign visitors to the Soviet capital. The launching of Sputnik that same year, while heightening Cold War tensions, also boosted Soviet confidence about engaging with the outside world. Within this context, the Soviet journalists' American experience contributed to what historians now call the information revolution of the late 1950s and early 1960s Soviet Union. While Soviet media remained tightly controlled, the absolute isolation of the Stalin years gave way to somewhat greater engagement with international information flows. For ordinary Soviet citizens, this meant slightly more access to information about the outside world, including some aspects of American society beyond the standard caricatures. For American newspapers, the Soviet delegation's visit was a minor event, noted briefly in industry publications, but largely overlooked by the general public. Yet, for the visiting Soviets, the experience was transformative. "We came expecting to confirm our preconceptions," one delegate later wrote in a memoir published during Glasnost. "We left questioning fundamental assumptions about how information should circulate in a modern society." The story of these Soviet journalists' encounter with American newspaper production illuminates a crucial but often overlooked aspect of the Cold War: the profound information asymmetry between the competing systems. While Americans had limited but real access to information about Soviet society through their massive media apparatus, Soviet citizens received highly filtered information about America through much more constrained channels. This asymmetry would persist throughout the Cold War, shaping how each society understood the other. The Soviet delegates returned to Moscow just as winter was setting in, both literally and metaphorically. Despite Khrushchev's reforms, the fundamental structures of Soviet information control remained intact. The journalists who had witnessed America's newspaper industry found themselves navigating a delicate balance: how to apply what they had learned without challenging ideological orthodoxies. Several members of the delegation faced professional consequences for their enthusiasm about certain aspects of American media. Two journalists who had written particularly admiring internal reports about the efficiency of American newspaper distribution were removed from international assignments. Others learned to couch their observations in appropriately critical language, emphasizing the capitalist and commercial aspects of American newspapers while downplaying their impressive reach and diversity. Yet the impact of their observations couldn't be entirely suppressed. Through professional networks, informal conversations, and carefully worded articles, their experiences filtered through the Soviet journalistic community. A generation of Soviet editors came to understand that there was another model of mass information distribution, one that reached far more people with far more content than their own system managed. This awareness contributed to a gradual shift in Soviet media philosophy. The Stalinist model had emphasized limited information, tightly controlled. The post-1955 approach, while maintaining firm control over content, increasingly recognized the importance of broader distribution and somewhat more engaging presentation. Newspapers were still instruments of the party, but there was growing recognition that they needed to be instruments that people actually wanted to read. The transformation was perhaps most visible in how Soviet papers covered technology and consumer goods. Before the mid-1950s, such coverage focused almost exclusively on industrial production for collective benefit. By the early 1960s, Soviet papers had begun acknowledging individual consumer desires, with articles about television sets, refrigerators, and even fashion, albeit always with appropriate ideological framing about socialist production meeting citizens' needs. This shift paralleled broader changes in the Cold War competition. After Khrushchev's famous kitchen debate with Vice President Nixon in 1959, Soviet leadership increasingly recognized that the competition with capitalism would be fought not just on military or industrial grounds, but also in the realm of everyday life and consumer satisfaction. Media coverage began to reflect this new understanding, with more attention to quality-of-life issues. For the American newspaper industry, the Soviet visit coincided with what many now recognize as the golden age of American print journalism. The 1950s saw newspaper circulation reach historic highs, with many cities supporting multiple competing dailies. The business model combining substantial subscription revenue with extensive advertising seemed unassailable. Few in the industry could imagine that the empire of paper and ink that so impressed the Soviet visitors would face existential challenges within a few decades. The Soviet journalists could not have known it, but they were witnessing American print journalism at its commercial and cultural peak. Television was still in its infancy, and the Internet lay decades in the future. For this brief window, newspapers dominated America's information ecosystem in a way they never would again. Their massive printing operations, which so stunned the Soviet visitors, represented the culmination of trends that had been building since the late 19th century and would begin to reverse in the late 20th. What the Soviet delegates saw in those New York printing plants was not just the technical achievement of mass production, but the physical manifestation of a society organized around information abundance rather than scarcity. American newspapers, for all their flaws and limitations, operated on the premise that more information broadly distributed was generally better than less information tightly controlled. This fundamentally different assumption about information's role in society would continue to distinguish Western and Soviet systems until the USSR's collapse. The contrast was not lost on thoughtful members of the Soviet delegation. "We pride ourselves on having created a workers' state," one journalist confided to an American counterpart during a rare unmonitored moment. "Yet I must ask myself, which system truly ensures that working people have greater access to information about their world? Our papers reach the workers, but how much of the world do they actually contain?" This philosophical question about the quantity, diversity, and accessibility of information in different social systems remained largely beneath the surface of official Cold War rhetoric. Yet it represented a fundamental divergence between the competing worldviews, one that would become increasingly important as the information age accelerated. For some members of the Soviet delegation, the American newspaper experience prompted deeper questions about Soviet society itself. If American papers could distribute so much information so efficiently without undermining social cohesion, was the Soviet approach of tight information control truly necessary? If millions of American workers chose to purchase and read these massive papers daily, what did that suggest about assumptions regarding what ordinary people wanted or needed to know? Such questions couldn't be openly debated in the Soviet context of the 1950s, yet they lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed the American newspaper industry firsthand. Several delegates who later rose to positions of influence in Soviet media would gradually work to expand the boundaries of permissible content, especially during the glasnost era decades later. The Soviet delegation returned to Moscow in December 1955, just as the first heavy snows blanketed the city. Their official report to the Central Committee emphasized the capitalistic nature of American newspapers, their subordination to advertising interests, and their anti-Soviet biases. Yet between the lines, their amazement at what they had witnessed was palpable. A system they had been taught was inferior had produced a media ecosystem of extraordinary scale and reach. As the delegation's train pulled into Moscow's Leningradsky station after their long journey home, they were greeted by a familiar sight: kiosks selling thin editions of Pravda and Izvestia, with their 8 to 12 pages of dense text and minimal graphics. For these journalists who had just witnessed the Sunday New York Times with its hundreds of pages, the contrast was unavoidable. Something fundamental had changed in their understanding of what was possible in mass communication. They had seen another world, one where information flowed, not in carefully measured drops, but in torrents. That knowledge, however deeply buried in classified reports and private reflections, could never be entirely forgotten. It would quietly influence Soviet media development for decades to come, as the empire of print that had so dazzled them continued its daily miracle of mass production across the ocean. In the years following the 1955 delegation's return to Moscow, the seeds of what they had witnessed in America began to germinate in unexpected ways throughout Soviet media culture. The visiting journalists had been instructed to study American newspaper production primarily to critique its capitalist excesses. Instead, many found themselves quietly admiring aspects of a system that, whatever its ideological foundation, managed to deliver more information to more citizens more efficiently than their own. The immediate changes were subtle but significant. By 1957, both Pravda and Izvestia had introduced slightly expanded weekend editions. While still thin by American standards, these editions included more photographs, expanded cultural coverage, and occasional features on topics previously considered too frivolous for serious Soviet publications, like home furnishing or family recreation. The justification, carefully phrased in internal memoranda, was that socialist citizens deserve comprehensive information about all aspects of modern life. Perhaps the most significant development came in the realm of newspaper distribution. The Soviet visitors had been particularly impressed by the complex logistics that delivered millions of American papers to homes and newsstands before dawn each day. Upon their return, several delegation members advocated for modernizing Soviet distribution systems. By 1958, Moscow had implemented new delivery protocols that significantly reduced the delay between printing and delivery for major publications. These changes coincided with a broader shift in Soviet media philosophy under Khrushchev. The absolutist control of the Stalin era gradually gave way to what scholars later termed managed information, still tightly controlled but somewhat more responsive to audience interests and expectations. Newspapers remained instruments of the party, but there was growing recognition that propaganda was most effective when people actually engaged with it. For Alexei Adjubey, the most politically connected member of the delegation as Khrushchev's son-in-law, The American experience proved particularly influential. When he became editor-in-chief of Izvestia in 1959, he implemented changes that made the newspaper somewhat more accessible and reader-friendly. Typography was modernized, photograph usage increased, and language became slightly less formulaic. While content remained firmly within ideological boundaries, the presentation evolved to hold readers' attention more effectively. American newspapers succeed because people choose to read them. Aju Bey reportedly told a closed meeting of Soviet editors in 1960, "We have the advantage of guaranteed circulation, but we should not take readers for granted." Socialist consciousness is best developed through engagement, not mere exposure to correct ideas. This pragmatic approach represented a significant shift from Stalinist media theory, which had treated newspapers primarily as instruments of top-down communication with little concern for reader engagement. The new approach still prioritized ideological correctness, but acknowledged that form and presentation mattered if messages were to be effectively received. The impact extended beyond Moscow's central publications. Regional Soviet newspapers, which had traditionally been even more limited in scope and distribution than the national dailies, began modest expansions in the late 1950s. Page counts increased slightly, local content received somewhat more attention, and distribution improved in many areas. While these provincial papers remained pale shadows of American regional dailies, they became somewhat more substantial publications than they had been before. These evolutionary changes in Soviet newspapers unfolded against the backdrop of the space race and intensifying Cold War competition. After the launch of Sputnik in 1957, Soviet media gained confidence in presenting their system as technologically advanced. Coverage of scientific and technical achievements expanded, with more detailed reporting on Soviet innovations. This shift aligned with what delegation members had observed in American papers: substantial coverage of technical and scientific developments presented in accessible language. By the early 1960s, the influence of the American newspaper experience had diffused through various channels of Soviet media culture. Young journalists who had not visited America nonetheless absorbed some lessons secondhand from those who had. Editorial practices evolved incrementally, with somewhat more attention to reader interests and slightly more diverse content. The basic structures of control remained firmly in place, but within those structures, the approach to engaging readers had shifted. This period also saw increased interest in journalism education and professionalization within the Soviet system. The Moscow State University Faculty of Journalism expanded its programs with new courses on layout, design, and audience engagement, areas that had received minimal attention in earlier periods when ideological orthodoxy was the primary concern for journalism training. For ordinary Soviet citizens, these changes translated into newspapers that, while still limited by Western standards, offered somewhat more information about both domestic and international developments. Coverage of the United States remained ideologically framed, but occasionally included details about everyday American life that would have been entirely absent in Stalin-era publications. The absolute information asymmetry of the early Cold War began to lessen, though it remained substantial. American newspapers remained largely unaware of their influence on Soviet media development. The 1955 delegation's visit had received minimal coverage in the U.S. Press typically framed as a minor diplomatic exchange rather than a potentially transformative encounter. Few American editors recognized that their Soviet counterparts were studying their operations with an intensity born of both professional curiosity and systemic insecurity. This one-sided awareness typified the information asymmetry of the Cold War. American media professionals operated with little knowledge of or interest in Soviet media practices, while their Soviet counterparts closely studied Western approaches, officially to critique them, unofficially to learn from them. This pattern, replicated across many professional and technical fields, created an advantage for Western systems that would become increasingly significant as information technologies advanced. By the mid-1960s, however, Both American and Soviet newspaper industries faced challenges that would have been difficult to anticipate in 1955. Television had emerged as a powerful competing medium in both societies, beginning a long-term erosion of newspaper readership and influence. While American papers maintained their massive circulation and production capacity through the 1960s, the first signs of the challenges ahead were becoming visible. For Soviet papers, the challenge was different but equally significant. Television created expectations for more engaging visual information presentation that the traditionally text-heavy Soviet press struggled to meet. As television ownership spread through Soviet society, newspapers faced pressure to become more appealing or risk losing audience attention, a concern that would have seemed unthinkable in the era of absolute information control. The political changes following Khrushchev's removal from power in 1964 also affected the trajectory of Soviet newspaper development. Under Leonid Brezhnev, the limited liberalization of the Khrushchev years gave way to a more conservative approach. Some of the innovations in newspaper content and presentation continued, but the pace of change slowed significantly. Ideological orthodoxy reasserted its primacy over reader engagement. Alexei Adjubey, who had pushed Izvestia toward a more reader-friendly approach, was immediately removed from his position following his father-in-law's fall from power. His editorial innovations remained, but the political backing for further evolution had disappeared. Soviet newspapers settled into what would later be called the era of stagnation, somewhat more substantial and diverse than Stalin-era publications, but far from the dynamic, information-rich environment the 1955 delegates had witnessed in America. For the journalists who had participated in that delegation, the subsequent decades brought varied fates. Some retreated into cautious conformity, their American observations buried in classified reports and private memories. Others found ways to continue pushing the boundaries of Soviet journalism within the constraints of the system. A few eventually became vocal advocates for media reform during the glasnost period of the late 1980s, their long-ago American experience finally finding open expression. Mikhail Satunov, who had been a junior member of the 1955 delegation representing Literaturnaya Gazeta, rose to become a significant figure in Soviet journalism by the 1970s. In a 1987 interview during the early glasnost period, he reflected on the long-term impact of that American visit. What we saw was not just newspapers, but a different relationship between information and society. It has taken us decades to fully process the implications of that difference. Indeed, the story of how Soviet journalists responded to American newspaper production reveals much about the broader Cold War competition between fundamentally different information systems. The capitalist model had produced an environment of information abundance, millions of pages distributed daily, containing diverse content from hard news to lifestyle features to classified advertisements. The socialist model had produced an environment of information scarcity, limited pages containing carefully curated content designed to support state objectives. The delegation's American experience forced Soviet media professionals to confront this contrast directly. Their response, cautious reform within rigid ideological boundaries, reflected the fundamental constraints of the Soviet system. Information control was too central to the Soviet project to be fundamentally reconsidered, yet the competitive pressure to engage citizens more effectively could not be entirely ignored. This tension between control and engagement would persist throughout the remaining decades of the Soviet Union. During periods of relative liberalization, newspapers would expand somewhat in scope and in diversity. During conservative retrenchments, ideological orthodoxy would reassert its primacy, yet the fundamental limitation remained. Soviet papers could never approach the scale, diversity, or reader responsiveness of their American counterparts without undermining the centralized information control that the system required. The technological gap in newspaper production also proved difficult to close. Despite investments in newer printing technology following the 1955 delegation's recommendations, Soviet newspaper production remained far less efficient than American operations. Paper quality was consistently poor, printing often blurry, and color reproduction limited. The industrial capacity that so impressed the Soviet visitors continued to elude their own system, reflecting broader challenges in Soviet consumer-oriented manufacturing. By the 1970s, the Soviet newspaper industry had reached a plateau of development that would remain largely unchanged until the final years of the USSR. Major papers like Pravda and Izvestia typically ran 6 to 8 pages daily, with weekend editions sometimes reaching 12 to 16 pages. Circulation figures were substantial. Pravda claimed over 10 million daily readers through various means of distribution, but content remained tightly controlled and limited in scope compared to Western publications. American newspapers, meanwhile, continued their massive daily production through the 1970s, though television was beginning to erode their advertising base and readership. The Sunday New York Times regularly exceeded 500 pages, and major metropolitan dailies produced editions of 80, 100 pages routinely. The contrast with Soviet publications remained stark, a physical manifestation of the different information philosophies underpinning each system. What the Soviet journalists had witnessed in 1955 was not merely a more advanced newspaper industry, but a fundamentally different approach to information in society. American papers, for all their commercial imperatives and establishment biases, operated on the premise that citizens should have access to diverse, abundant information from which they could form their own conclusions. Soviet papers operated on the premise that information should be carefully curated to guide citizens toward correct conclusions. This philosophical difference became increasingly significant as the information revolution accelerated in the late 20th century. The Soviet approach to information control, which could be maintained relatively effectively in an era of centralized mass media, would prove fundamentally incompatible with the networked information technologies that emerged in subsequent decades. The visiting Soviet journalists of 1955 could not have anticipated how thoroughly information technology would transform both societies in the coming decades. Yet their astonishment at American newspaper production contained the seeds of a recognition that would become increasingly important. Information abundance created a different kind of society than information scarcity, with profound implications for how citizens understood their world and their place within it. As glasnost took hold in the late 1980s, Soviet newspapers finally began the transformation that had been implicitly suggested by that long-ago American visit. Publications expanded dramatically in size, content diversification accelerated, and formerly taboo topics entered public discussion. The physical limitations of Soviet printing technology meant that papers still couldn't match the sheer volume of their American counterparts, but the philosophical shift toward greater information access was unmistakable. Several veterans of the 1955 delegation played significant roles in this final transformation of Soviet media. Having kept their American observations largely private for decades, they could finally advocate openly for the reforms they had long believed necessary. Their arguments often referenced that formative experience. We have known since the 1950s that our approach to information was unnecessarily restrictive, one former delegate wrote in a 1989 editorial. What we saw in America then showed us another possibility, one more compatible with the informed citizenry that socialism should aspire to create. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 brought the final dissolution of the centralized media system that had sent those journalists to America decades earlier. In the chaotic media environment that followed, the American model of commercial newspapers became one template for the emerging Russian press. New publications embraced Western-style format, content diversity, and business models, though in a society without the democratic traditions and legal protections that had shaped American media development. The legacy of that 1955 encounter between Soviet journalists and American newspaper production thus came full circle. What began as a cautious delegation sent to study a competing system ended, decades later, with that competing system becoming a model for post-Soviet media development. The massive printing operations that had so astonished Alexei Adjubey and his colleagues became, in a sense, the blueprint for Russia's post-communist information environment. Yet this apparent triumph of the American model proved short-lived. By the time the Soviet Union collapsed, American newspapers themselves were beginning their long decline in the face of digital disruption. The empire of paper and ink that had so impressed the Soviet visitors was already past its peak, with circulation numbers falling and advertising revenue beginning to shift to other media. The model that post-Soviet media sought to emulate was itself becoming obsolete. This historical irony underscores the complexity of the information revolution that has transformed both societies since that Cold War encounter. Neither the American nor the Soviet approach to information management survived intact into the 21st century. The centralized control that characterized Soviet media proved incompatible with networked digital technologies, while the industrial-scale print operations that defined American newspapers proved economically unsustainable in the Internet era. What remains relevant from this historical episode is the fundamental question it raised. What relationship between information and society best serves human flourishing? The Soviet journalists who stood amazed on the production floor of the New York Times in 1955 were witnessing not just technological prowess, but a different answer to this question than their own system had provided. Their experience reminds us that information systems are never merely technical achievements, but embody deep assumptions about how societies should function. The millions of newspaper pages rolling off American presses represented a bet on information abundance, a belief that citizens could navigate diverse, sometimes contradictory information to reach their own conclusions. The limited pages of Soviet publications represented a bet on information curation, a belief that citizens needed expert guidance to reach correct conclusions. Neither approach perfectly fulfilled its promises. American newspapers, for all their impressive production capacity, often reinforced establishment perspectives and commercial interests. Soviet newspapers, for all their ideological coherence, failed to engage citizens or provide the information necessary for genuine participation in social development. Both systems contained contradictions that would contribute to their eventual transformation. Yet the stark contrast between these approaches, so vividly experienced by those Soviet visitors in 1955, illuminates choices that remain relevant in our contemporary information environment. As digital platforms have created new forms of both abundance and control, societies continue to navigate the fundamental tensions between information diversity and coherence, between individual choice and collective guidance, between the marketplace of ideas and the curation of truth. The astonishment of Soviet journalists at American newspaper production thus offers more than a Cold War curiosity. It provides a window into enduring questions about information's role in society. Their experience captures a moment when two radically different approaches to these questions came into direct contact, each confronting in the other both a challenge and a possibility. For Alexei Adjubey and his colleagues, returning to Moscow after witnessing America's newspaper industry, the challenge was to reconcile what they had seen with what they believed. How could a system they had been taught was fundamentally flawed produce such impressive results? How could their own supposedly superior system lag so dramatically in information production and distribution? These questions, though rarely articulated explicitly, lingered in the subsequent evolution of Soviet media until the system's final collapse. The American newspaper industry, meanwhile, continued its massive daily production, largely unaware of its role as both demonstration and challenge to a competing information system. The millions of pages that so impressed the Soviet visitors were, for Americans, simply the expected daily miracle of modern communication, remarkable only in its reliability and ubiquity. This asymmetric awareness characterized much of the Cold War competition. Soviet professionals across many fields studied their American counterparts with intense interest, officially to critique, but unofficially to learn. American professionals, generally secure in their system's superiority, paid far less attention to developments on the other side. This pattern created an information advantage for Western systems that would prove significant in the Cold War's final decades. By the time Mikhail Gorbachev introduced glasnost in the mid-1980s, the Soviet media system had reached the limits of its development under centralized control. The reforms that followed, expanding newspaper content, reducing censorship, allowing diverse perspectives, represented an implicit acknowledgement that the American model glimpsed by those 1955 visitors had certain advantages that could no longer be ignored. Yet this belated shift came as American newspapers themselves faced unprecedented challenges. The classified advertising that had funded much of their massive production was beginning to migrate online. Reader attention was fragmenting across multiple media. The economic foundation of industrial-scale newspaper production was eroding, though the full implications would take decades to unfold. This confluence, Soviet media finally embracing aspects of the American model just as that model itself began to falter, created a brief window of parallel development in the late 1980s and early 1990s. For a historical moment, Russian and American newspapers moved closer in format, content diversity, and relationship to readers than at any time since the Bolshevik Revolution. Both systems, from opposite starting points, were converging toward a similar middle ground. This convergence proved temporary. In Russia, economic chaos and political consolidation soon pushed much of the media back toward centralized control, though now justified by nationalism rather than Marxism-Leninism. In America, digital disruption continued to erode the industrial foundations of newspaper production, with publications shrinking in size, scope, and influence despite their continued editorial independence. The massive printing operations that so impressed the Soviet visitors have largely disappeared from the American media landscape. Major newspapers have closed, consolidated, or dramatically reduced their physical presence. The New York Times still produces a print edition, but its future clearly lies in digital distribution. The empire of paper and ink that represented the pinnacle of industrial-age information distribution has given way to networked digital systems with very different characteristics. What lessons should we draw from this historical encounter between competing information systems? Perhaps the most important is that information environments reflect deeper societal values and assumptions. The Soviet and American newspaper industries weren't merely different in scale or technology. They embodied fundamentally different beliefs about citizens' relationship to information. The American system, for all its flaws, assumed that citizens could handle information abundance, that exposure to diverse, sometimes conflicting perspectives was not dangerous but essential to social functioning. The Soviet system assumed that information needed careful curation, that citizens required expert guidance to reach correct conclusions, and that unfiltered information posed potential risks to social cohesion. These competing assumptions have reemerged in our digital environment, though in forms their Cold War proponents could scarcely have imagined. Today's debates about content moderation, algorithmic filtering, and information literacy echo those fundamental tensions between abundance and curation, between individual navigation and institutional guidance. The astonishment of those Soviet journalists at America's newspaper production thus contains insights relevant to contemporary information challenges. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of this story is the personal impact on the Soviet journalists themselves. For many, the American visit created a private contradiction they would carry for decades between what they had witnessed and what they could publicly acknowledge. Their professional lives unfolded in the space between these competing realities, attempting to improve Soviet media within strict ideological boundaries, while privately recognizing the limitations of that approach. Alexei Adjubey's career perhaps best exemplifies this tension. Following his father-in-law's fall from power, he lost his position at Izvestia and spent years in professional obscurity. Yet he continued to advocate quietly for media reforms, drawing on his American observations to argue for more reader-oriented approaches within acceptable ideological parameters. By the Glasnost era, he had re-emerged as a voice for media transformation, his long-ago American experience finally finding open expression. For the American newspaper industry, the Soviet delegation's visit represented a missed opportunity for mutual understanding. Had American editors recognized the significance of what their Soviet counterparts were witnessing, they might have gained valuable insights into how their own system appeared from the outside, both its impressive capabilities and its blind spots. Such reflection might have better prepared them for the challenges that would later transform their industry. Instead, the visit remained largely a one-way exchange, Soviet journalists absorbing transformative impressions while their American hosts conducted business as usual. This asymmetry mirrored the broader information imbalance of the Cold War, where Western societies maintained substantially more knowledge about their Soviet counterparts than vice versa, despite Soviet efforts at systematic information gathering. As our contemporary information environment continues to evolve, the lessons of this historical encounter remain relevant. Information systems reflect fundamental societal values. They embody assumptions about citizens' capabilities and needs. They establish patterns of knowledge distribution that shape how societies understand themselves and others. The contrasting approaches of American and Soviet newspaper production illuminated these connections in particularly stark terms. The Soviet journalists who stood amazed on the production floor of the New York Times in 1955 were witnessing more than an industrial achievement. They were confronting a different vision of how information and society could interact, one that both challenged their assumptions and expanded their sense of what was possible. Their experience reminds us that information systems are never merely technical or economic arrangements, but expressions of deeper beliefs about human capabilities and social organization. As we navigate our own information challenges in the digital age, this historical perspective offers valuable context. The questions raised by that Cold War encounter about abundance versus curation, individual navigation versus institutional guidance, diversity versus coherence remain central to contemporary debates. The astonishment of Soviet journalists at American newspaper production thus serves not only as historical curiosity, but as a window into enduring tensions in our relationship with information. The ultimate irony is that neither system survived intact into the digital era. The centralized control of Soviet media proved incompatible with networked information technologies, while the industrial-scale print operations of American newspapers proved economically unsustainable in the Internet age. Both approaches, from opposite starting points, failed to adapt fully to the new information environment that emerged in subsequent decades. Yet the fundamental questions they embodied remain unresolved. How much information can citizens productively navigate? What role should institutions play in curating information flows? How can societies balance the benefits of information diversity against the needs for shared understanding? These questions, highlighted by the 1955 encounter between Soviet journalists and American newspaper production, continue to shape our evolving relationship with information in the digital age. For those Soviet journalists who returned to Moscow after witnessing America's newspaper industry, these questions became personal as well as professional. They had seen another possibility, a different relationship between information and society than what their own system provided. That knowledge, however carefully buried in classified reports and private reflections, could never be entirely forgotten. It quietly influenced Soviet media development for decades to come, as the empire of print that had so dazzled them continued its daily miracle of mass production across the ocean.